There are letters that get written and never sent. There are letters that get sent and never read. And then there are letters that travel across decades, through mud and silence and the hands of strangers, and finally land exactly where they were always meant to go, changing everything in a single afternoon. This is one of those letters. And the family it found had no idea their lives were about to split into a before and an after. The year was 1944, and the world was on fire in a way that no generation before or since has quite understood. Young men were being shipped to Europe by the hundreds of thousands. Boys who had been sitting in high school classrooms the previous spring now crouched in rain-soaked trenches in France, writing letters home by the light of whatever they could find. Most of those letters said the same things. "I'm fine, don't worry, I'll be home soon." Because what else do you say to the people you love when the truth is too heavy to carry across an ocean? Thomas Aldrich was 22 years old when he wrote his letter. He was from a small town in rural Pennsylvania called Dunmore's Creek, the kind of place where everybody knew your name and your grandmother's name, and the name of the dog you'd had as a kid. He had joined up in 1942, not because he was fearless, but because he believed, the way young men of that generation believed, that some things were worth bleeding for. He had a mother named Eleanor, a father named George, who had lost 2 fingers in a mill accident but still worked every day, and a younger sister named Ruth, who was 15 and collected pressed flowers in a journal she kept under her bed. Thomas also had a girl. Her name was Clara Henning, and she had green eyes and a laugh that could make a room feel 3 times bigger. They had grown up 2 streets apart, fallen into each other's orbit at a church social in the summer of 1941, and spent the next year figuring out that what they felt wasn't just a passing thing. It was the kind of feeling that plants roots. When Thomas shipped out, Clara stood at the end of her porch and watched his car disappear down the road, and told herself she would not cry until she got back inside. She made it to the door. He wrote to her every week for 2 years. Long letters, detailed letters, letters that smelled like whatever mud or rain or wood smoke had worked its way into the paper. He told her about the men in his unit. He told her about a village in France where an old woman had given them bread without being asked. He told her about the stars, which looked the same over the trenches as they did over Dunmore's Creek, and how sometimes he'd stare up at them and imagine she was looking at them too. Clara saved every single one. She kept them in a shoebox in the top of her closet, and when she missed him past the point of bearing, she'd sit on the floor with the box in her lap and read until she could breathe again. The last letter came in September of 1944, and then nothing. The telegram arrived 11 days later. Thomas Aldrich had been killed in action during a push near a small French town called Montmirail. His body had been recovered. He would be buried with full military honors. Clara read the telegram 3 times, folded it with great care, and sat down at her kitchen table, and did not move for a very long time. She was 20 years old. She had not yet learned how to carry something that heavy, and she spent the next several years figuring it out one painful day at a time. But here is the thing about Thomas's last letter, the one he wrote just before that final push. It never arrived. It was found in the trench after the fighting, folded into the front pocket of a jacket, sodden and half buried in mud. A French soldier discovered it, couldn't read the English, and passed it to a Red Cross worker named Michel Beaumont, who spoke just enough to understand that it was personal and important. Michel kept it. He meant to find a way to send it. But the chaos of the final months of the war swallowed his intention, and the letter ended up in a wooden box with other recovered documents that sat in the basement of a record-keeping office in Lyon for over 70 years. Michel Beaumont died in 1991. His daughter Hélène was sorting through his belongings when she found the box with the letter inside, still folded, the ink blurred but not destroyed. Hélène couldn't read English either, but she could see the name written on the outside, Clara Henning, Dunmore's Creek, Pennsylvania, and she kept it, the way her father had kept it, with the vague but persistent feeling that it mattered. She tried twice in the 90s to locate someone by that name. Both times she ran into walls. The internet was still young and the world was still large. Then, in 2019, Hélène's granddaughter Isabelle, 26, studying history at university in Paris, found the letter in a drawer and decided she wasn't going to let it stay unfound any longer. It took Isabel 4 months of searching. Social media, genealogy databases, a post in an American history forum that got shared over 200 times, before she found a connection. Clara Henning had married a man named David Marsh in 1949. She had lived in Pennsylvania her whole life. She had died in 2003 at the age of 79. But she had a daughter named Patricia, who was 71 and still lived 40 minutes from Dunmore's Creek. The email Isabel sent to Patricia Marsh arrived on a Thursday morning in November. Patricia read it 3 times, the way her mother had read that telegram, and called her own daughter, a woman named Anne, who was 43 and worked as a school librarian, and said, "I think someone found something that belongs to our family." Anne drove to her mother's house that same afternoon. They video called Isabel together, and through the screen of a laptop on a kitchen table in Pennsylvania, a young woman in Paris held up a letter that was 75 years old and carefully unfolded it. Her English was careful and deliberate as she read it aloud, and the kitchen in Pennsylvania went completely still. Thomas had written about the night before the push. He'd written that he wasn't afraid, or at least that he was choosing not to be. He'd written about a conversation he'd had with another soldier, a man from Georgia named Earl, who had shown him a photograph of his wife and newborn son and said, "That right there is what I'm walking toward, not what I'm running from." Thomas wrote that he understood that now. He wasn't running from anything. He was walking toward Clara, toward a house with a porch, toward Sunday mornings and the smell of coffee and the sound of her laughing at something he'd said. He wrote that he had decided, somewhere in the mud and the noise of that war, that survival wasn't just about the body. It was about keeping something tender alive inside you, even when everything around you was trying to make you hard. He wrote that she had been that tender thing for him, that she had kept him human, and then, at the end of the letter, he wrote something that made Patricia Marsh put her hand over her mouth and Anne reach for her mother's arm. He wrote, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that loving you was the clearest thing I ever did. It was the one thing I never second-guessed. If I don't make it back, please don't spend your life waiting at the window. Go out and live it. Live it so fully and so boldly that it echoes. Because that's what I'll be listening for." Clara had never read those words, but she had lived them. She had married David in 1949, raised Patricia in the same town where she'd grown up, planted a garden that neighbors still talked about, taught Sunday school for 20 years, and laughed, often and loudly, until the very end of her life. She had kept Thomas's letters in a shoebox that Patricia had found after Clara died, and she had kept one photograph of him on the windowsill of her bedroom for the rest of her life. Not in grief. In gratitude, Patricia always thought, as if he were someone she was still thankful for. Isabel sent the original letter, carefully preserved behind archival glass, to Patricia 2 weeks after the video call. It arrived on a cold December morning. Patricia held it in both hands for a long time before she opened the package. Then she called Anne, and they read it again together, this time in the same room, with the actual paper between them. The ink was faded, the edges were soft with age, but the words were still there, still holding everything Thomas had meant them to hold. Anne later said that what struck her most was not the sadness of it, though there was sadness, the deep, clean kind that comes from understanding a loss fully for the first time. What struck her was the feeling that the letter had arrived exactly when it was supposed to. Not in 1944, when it might have broken Clara in a way she couldn't recover from. Not in the 50s or 60s, when the wound was still too raw. But now, when the women who loved Thomas were the daughters and granddaughters of the woman he'd written it to. Women who could receive it with open hands instead of a shattered heart. Some stories don't end. They just wait for the right moment to finish being told. Thomas Aldrich wrote his letter in a trench in France 75 years ago, and it traveled through mud and decades in 2 languages in the careful hands of people who understood somehow that it mattered. It found its way home, and, in a kitchen in Pennsylvania, on a cold December morning, a family finally heard the last thing a young man wanted to say before he walked toward the thing he was most afraid of, and discovered that every word he'd written was still, impossibly, true.